Welcome to the Nepalese Diaspora Network podcast. We're your go-to source for all things Nepal, bringing you news, views, and insights from every corner of the global Nepalese community. If you're a regular reader of our newsletter, you know we've got our fingers on the pulse of what's happening back home.
Absolutely, and in this deep dive, we're going to unpack some of the most significant developments we've been tracking. Think of it as your one-stop shop for understanding the latest trends and events shaping Nepal today.
Couldn't have put it better myself. We've got a lot to cover this time, from the economy's unexpected twists and turns to some important updates on the social and cultural front, not to mention the ever-evolving political landscape. And of course, we'll be exploring how all of this resonates with the global Nepalese community.
It's a fascinating mix, as always.
Just like our newsletter teased, we're going from plunging tomato prices and booming soybean oil exports to rhino mysteries and socialist mergers. Buckle up, folks. We're diving right in.
Let's kick things off with the economy, shall we? There's been a lot of buzz lately about a pretty sharp drop in vegetable prices.
Yeah, I saw some headlines about that. Seems like good news for consumers, right?
Well, it depends on where you're shopping. According to the Kathmandu Post, one of Nepal's leading English dailies, wholesale prices have plummeted. Like, in some cases, we're talking a two-thirds reduction compared to just last month.
Wow, two-thirds. That's huge. What's behind such a dramatic drop?
It seems to be a classic case of supply and demand at play. The peak winter harvest has rolled in, and production levels are back to normal. The Kalamati Fruits and Vegetable Market Development Board, that's the main wholesale hub in Kathmandu, reported some pretty significant price cuts. Take large Nepalese tomatoes, for instance. They've seen a whopping 66.67% decrease, coming in at just over 18 rupees per kilogram.
18 rupees, that's incredibly cheap.
At the wholesale level, it is. But remember, this is wholesale. Smooth gourds have also taken a hit, down about 61%, and green broad beans have dropped over 57%. So at least for the wholesalers, this is a welcome change.
I bet. But as someone who buys groceries, I'm curious, are these savings actually trickling down to us at the retail level?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The Kathmandu Post article actually points out that retail prices haven't quite caught up. Those tomatoes selling for around 18 rupees wholesale are still going for 50 to 55 rupees per kilogram in your local market.
So there's still a pretty hefty markup.
Exactly. There's that margin to consider, plus all the different steps in the supply chain. It really makes you think about the efficiency or lack thereof in that whole system.
It does. Now, even with this recent dip in wholesale prices, our newsletter mentioned that overall vegetable inflation has actually gone up over the past year.
That's a crucial point to keep in mind. If we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the data paints a different story. According to figures released in mid-February by Nepal Rashtra Bank, that's Nepal's central bank, the year-on-year inflation rate for vegetables was up by 7.56%.
So even though we're enjoying this temporary price break, the overall cost of veggies has still gone up compared to this time last year.
Precisely. It's a good reminder that short-term fluctuations don't always tell the whole story. There are longer-term economic trends at play that we need to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. So a mixed bag on the vegetable front, but let's shift gears to something that sounds a bit more optimistic: Nepal's exports. Apparently, they've seen a pretty significant jump recently.
That they have. The Rising Nepal, another state-owned English daily, reported that Nepal's exports surged by an impressive 57.2% in the first 8 months of the current fiscal year.
That's a pretty substantial increase, and the big winner seems to be soybean oil, right?
You got it. Soybean oil exports have skyrocketed to a staggering 47.94 billion rupees during those 8 months. To put that in perspective, in the same period last year, we're talking a mere 754 million rupees.
I don't even know how to describe that increase.
It's massive. And just in the month of Falgun, that's mid-February to mid-March, soybean oil exports alone were worth 15.53 billion rupees. It now accounts for roughly 30% of Nepal's total exports.
Wow, a single commodity driving that much of the export market? Makes you wonder what's fueling such incredible growth.
Right. Is it increased production? Are we tapping into new markets? Or maybe there's a shift happening in regional trade dynamics. It's a question worth exploring further.
It definitely raises some interesting questions. But amidst all this export excitement, the newsletter also mentioned that imports are still high, which isn't exactly great news.
True. As encouraging as the export growth is, it's important to remember that imports also rose by 11.2% during that same period.
So even though we're selling more abroad, we're still buying a lot more from other countries.
Unfortunately, yes. This means the trade deficit, the difference between imports and exports, has actually widened, reaching over 987 billion rupees.
So that fundamental challenge of the trade deficit persists.
It does. And it underscores the need for strategies that promote more balanced trade and reduce our reliance on imports.
Makes sense. Now, shifting to a topic that's a bit more concerning, public debt in Nepal has reportedly reached a new high.
That's right. My Republica, another prominent English daily, reported that Nepal's public debt has climbed to a hefty 2.676 trillion rupees. That's a significant chunk of the country's GDP, 46.91% to be precise.
Almost half of the GDP. That sounds like a pretty heavy burden to carry. How much has it increased recently?
Well, in just the first 8 months of the current fiscal year, the government took on an additional 241.93 billion rupees in loans.
So the debt is accumulating at a pretty rapid pace.
It is, and that raises questions about where all this borrowed money is going. A big chunk of it, 758.58 billion rupees to be exact, went towards what's called regular expenditure and debt servicing. Basically, things like paying government salaries and covering interest payments on existing loans.
So keeping the lights on and the wheels turning, so to speak.
Essentially, yes. In contrast, a much smaller amount, only 82.6 billion rupees, was allocated to capital expenditure. That's the money that goes towards infrastructure development, building projects that could potentially boost the economy in the long run.
So it sounds like a lot more money is going towards maintaining the status quo than investing in future growth.
That's the concern, yes. And to make matters even more complicated, the depreciation of the Nepalese rupee against the US dollar has added another layer of pressure. It's made servicing foreign currency loans more expensive, further increasing the debt burden by over 66 billion rupees.
So we've got this combination of rising debt and, it seems, a questionable allocation of resources. It paints a worrying picture for Nepal's long-term development, wouldn't you say?
It certainly raises questions about the sustainability of our current fiscal approach.
Definitely something to watch closely. Now, the newsletter had a few other interesting snippets on the economic front.
Right, let's touch on those quickly. First up, commercial banks issued 22.74 billion rupees in new loans last month. This lending surge was partly driven by the need to finance those rising imports we talked about earlier. Things like raw materials for our booming export industries, particularly edible oils, as well as margin loans.
So the lending is fueling both the import and export sides of the equation.
Exactly. It's an intricate web of interconnected factors.
Indeed. Now, what about this push for pumped storage hydropower projects?
Ah, yes. The Nepal Electricity Authority, or NEA, has been making a lot of noise about this. They're currently conducting feasibility studies for projects like the Sirafu Lake project and the potentially massive Hulingtardukim project, which would be located near Kathmandu.
Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with this technology, could you give us a quick rundown of what pumped storage hydropower is all about?
Sure. In simple terms, think of it as a giant water battery. The basic idea is to use surplus electricity, often generated during off-peak hours, to pump water uphill into a reservoir. Then, when electricity demand is high, you release that water downhill, and it spins turbines to generate power. It's a clever way to store energy and ensure a stable electricity supply, even when demand fluctuates.
So it's a way to smooth out the bumps and make sure the lights stay on, even during peak hours.
Exactly. It's a crucial piece of the energy security puzzle, especially as Nepal continues to develop and demand for electricity grows.
Makes sense. Now, what's the latest with the Nepal Stock Exchange? I saw some headlines about a downturn.
Unfortunately, yes. The Nepal Stock Exchange, or NFPSE as it's known, has been on a bit of a roller coaster ride lately. It took a tumble of over 12 points just this Thursday, and overall, investors have seen around 111 billion rupees wiped off their portfolios in the past week alone.
Ouch, that's gonna hurt. What's driving this decline?
Well, a lot of fingers are pointing to the ongoing political uncertainty and the delay in appointing a new governor for Nepal Rashtra Bank. This leadership vacuum at the central bank has created a bit of a wait-and-see approach among investors.
So it's a combination of political jitters and uncertainty about the future direction of monetary policy.
Precisely. And that kind of ambiguity doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the stock market.
Right. So, to sum it up, we've got a bit of a mixed bag on the economic front. Strong growth in certain exports, soybean oil being the star, but those concerns about rising public debt and a jittery stock market aren't going away anytime soon. Let's turn our attention now to some social and cultural news. Sadly, there have been reports of a significant number of rhino deaths in Chitwan National Park.
Yes, it's heartbreaking news. 21 horned rhinos have died in Chitwan in just the past 8 months.
20. That's a significant number.
It is, but thankfully the authorities have indicated that most of these deaths appear to be due to natural causes, things like attacks by tigers or crocodiles, fights between rhinos, illnesses, and old age.
So it's not poaching or habitat loss that's driving these deaths.
No, it seems to align with the typical patterns we've seen in recent years. Of course, any loss is a cause for concern, especially given the rhino's endangered status.
Absolutely. Chitwan is such a crucial sanctuary for these incredible creatures.
It is. Remember, Chitwan is home to the vast majority of Nepal's rhino population, 694 out of the total 752 recorded in the 2021 census.
Speaking of the census, our newsletter mentioned something about it being suspended this year. Is that right?
Unfortunately, yes. The National Rhino Census, which usually happens every 5 years to track population numbers and assess the overall health of the rhino population, has been put on hold this year.
That's a shame. Why the suspension?
It seems to be a funding issue. Reports suggest that the termination of support from USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, has impacted a number of conservation initiatives in Nepal, including the rhino census.
Ah, so a funding shortfall is putting a critical conservation effort on hold. That's not good news.
No, it's not ideal. Having accurate and up-to-date census data is essential for developing effective conservation strategies. So this suspension is a setback.
It really highlights how much conservation efforts rely on consistent funding. These rhinos are such an iconic symbol of Nepal's natural heritage, and their well-being should be a priority.
I agree. They're not just ecologically important, they hold immense cultural and national significance. How we protect them reflects our commitment to safeguarding Nepal's unique biodiversity.
Absolutely. Now let's switch gears again and delve into the world of politics and governance, where there seems to be quite a bit of activity. Prachanda, the chairman of the CPN, Maoist Center, has announced plans for a major political shakeup.
He has indeed. He's publicly stated his intention to unite all socialist and Maoist political forces under one banner before the next general elections in 2084 BS. That's according to the Nepali calendar, of course.
So a potential merger of left-leaning parties on the horizon. Interesting. What's the reasoning behind this move?
Well, speaking at a gathering in Chitwan, Prachanda expressed confidence that his party is strong enough to compete independently in the upcoming elections. He's not keen on forming alliances this time around. He also reiterated his long-standing support for a directly elected presidential system, arguing that it's crucial for Nepal's future development.
So a bold move to consolidate power and push for a different political system. Now, on the other side of the political spectrum, it seems there's some pushback against the Election Commission's proposed changes to the rules for national party status.
You're right. Several smaller political parties are voicing strong opposition to the Election Commission's proposals. Currently, to be recognized as a national party, a party needs to secure at least 3% of the proportional representation votes and win at least one first-past-the-post seat. But the proposed amendments would introduce even stricter criteria.
What kind of criteria are we talking about?
Well, for one, parties would need to field candidates in 70% of the total constituencies. They'd also need to maintain inclusive party structures at various levels, meaning representation from different groups within society.
Sounds like a pretty high bar to clear.
It is. And that's precisely the problem, according to parties like the Nepal Janamat Party and the CPN Unified Socialist. They argue that these tougher rules disproportionately favor the bigger, more established parties like the Nepali Congress and the CPN UML, and could end up marginalizing smaller parties that represent specific regional or minority interests.
So it's a classic debate between ensuring stability through larger parties and preserving a more diverse range of political voices.
Exactly. The Election Commission, on the other hand, argues that national parties should demonstrate a broader base of support across the country, which is a fair point. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
Indeed. Now, how about the resurgence of former King Gyanendra Shah and the pro-monarchy movement? That seems to be creating some political ripples.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
The former king has been making more public appearances lately, and there have been rallies organized by those advocating for a return to the monarchy. It's definitely adding another layer of complexity to the political scene.
So the monarchy is back in the conversation, at least to some extent. What's the reaction from the political establishment?
Well, within the Rastriya Prajatantra Party, that's the RPP, which has traditionally aligned with royalist sentiments, there seems to be some internal disagreement brewing.
Disagreement about what?
About who should be leading the charge for a monarchy restoration. It seems there isn't a unified strategy even amongst those who support the idea of bringing back the king.
So even within the royalist camp, there's a bit of a leadership struggle going on. Fascinating. And what about the whispers of external interference in all of this?
Following her recent trip to India, Foreign Minister Arzu Ranadoba was quick to deny any suggestion of Indian meddling in Nepal's internal affairs. She stated that India fully supports the democratic system in Nepal and emphasized that her discussions with Indian officials didn't delve deeply into Nepal's internal political matters.
So at least officially, the government is downplaying any external influence. But the speculation continues, especially with those pro-monarchy demonstrations gaining some momentum.
It does make you wonder about the dynamics at play behind the scenes.
For sure. Now, in what seems like a pretty significant shift in international relations, China appears to be increasing its engagement with the Nepali Congress Party after years of focusing primarily on communist parties.
You're right, that's a development worth noting. For a long time, China's engagement with Nepal has been heavily tilted towards the various communist parties. But recently, we've seen a noticeable uptick in interactions between the Chinese Communist Party, or CPC, and the Nepali Congress, or NC.
What kind of interactions are we talking about?
Well, there was a recent visit to China by a high-level NC delegation, and they had meetings with some pretty senior CPC officials. This could signal a strategic recalibration of China's diplomatic approach in Nepal, with a focus on building stronger ties across a broader political spectrum.
It makes sense for China to cultivate relationships with all the major political players in Nepal to ensure its interests are represented no matter who's in power.
It's a smart long-term strategy.
Absolutely. And finally, in the realm of politics and governance, it seems there's a new initiative aimed at revitalizing Nepal's tourism sector.
That's right. The Nepal Tourism Board, or NTB, and the United Nations Development Program, better known as UNDP, have joined forces to launch a $5 million Sustainable Tourism Project, or SDP for short.
$5 million, that's a significant investment. What's the project all about?
The goal is to boost the quality of tourism services in Nepal, provide essential skills training to those working in the tourism industry, and develop and promote a wider range of tourist destinations across the country. It's a 3-year initiative running from 2025 to 2028, and a key focus is on creating jobs. They're aiming for 2,500 sustainable jobs within the tourism sector and improving the skills of 5,000 individuals.
So it's about more than just attracting tourists. It's about making the industry more sustainable and beneficial for local communities in the long run.
Exactly. The project will also focus on developing small-scale tourism infrastructure, enhancing trekking routes, and encouraging the use of digital technologies in the tourism industry. It's an exciting step towards making Nepal's tourism sector more resilient, responsible, and beneficial for all involved.
Sounds like a really positive initiative. Now let's touch briefly on diaspora and globalization, which is always a key focus for us. We've already discussed the impressive surge in soybean oil exports, which obviously has global implications. What other developments are happening in this space?
Well, the Indo-Nepal International Trade Fair and Tourism Festival recently wrapped up in Dehradun, India. This event was all about promoting greater trade, tourism, and cultural exchange between Nepal and India.
Sounds like a great initiative to strengthen those cross-border ties.
It was. There was a good turnout from entrepreneurs and businesses on both sides of the border. And to make things easier, the operating hours for the Bambasa border bridge, which is a major crossing point, were temporarily extended during the festival. This allowed for a smoother flow of goods and people, which is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Anything that facilitates movement and fosters closer ties between Nepal and its neighbors is a win-win in my book. Now, I understand there's also some news about making it easier for overseas Nepalese to contribute to Social Security back home.
You're right. Isawa Money Transfer, which many of our listeners will be familiar with, has teamed up with Nepal's Social Security Fund, or SSF. This partnership will allow Nepalese working or self-employed abroad to contribute to Nepal's social security system through Isawa's global network.
So it's about streamlining the process and making it more accessible for the diaspora to participate in those crucial social welfare programs back home?
Exactly. It's a fantastic initiative that strengthens those vital connections between the diaspora and Nepal.
I couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap things up, we have a quick message for our listeners in the UK.
If you're a Nepalese individual living in the United Kingdom, we'd like to highlight a valuable resource for you, belayat.uk.
Belayat.uk. Tell us more.
It's a classifieds website specifically designed for the Nepalese community in the UK. You can find listings for job openings, housing options, local community events, and even businesses owned and run by fellow Nepalese. It's a great way to connect with the community and find all sorts of essential services and information.
Sounds like a handy platform for our UK listeners. So, to recap our deep dive into recent events in Nepal, we've seen a mixed bag of economic developments. From those fluctuating vegetable prices to that phenomenal surge in soybean oil exports, there's a lot happening. And we can't forget those concerns about rising public debt and some volatility in the financial markets.
On the social front, we talked about the unfortunate rhino deaths in Chitwan and the suspension of the national rhino census due to funding shortages.
Politically, things are as dynamic as ever, with talks of party mergers, debates over electoral rules, and the reemergence of royalist sentiments. And all of this is unfolding against a backdrop of evolving international relations, with China expanding its engagement beyond traditional communist allies.
And for the diaspora, we're seeing positive steps towards stronger economic and social ties with Nepal, from that cross-border trade fair to easier ways to contribute to the social security system.
It's clear that what happens in Nepal has ripple effects that extend far beyond its borders. And it leaves us with a lot to ponder. Will this heavy reliance on soybean oil exports create vulnerabilities down the line? How will Nepal tackle its growing public debt? And how will the political landscape continue to shift and reshape itself? These are all questions that will continue to unfold in the months and years ahead.
For those of you who want to stay informed and connected with the latest news and analysis relevant to the global Nepalese diaspora, be sure to visit our website at nepalidiaspora.net. You'll find a wealth of information and resources there.
And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the latest developments in Nepal. We'll be back soon with another episode, so stay tuned.
Until next time.